On this episode, Scott and I welcome Nicholas Starke, threat researcher at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, to discuss the pulse of firmware, what's happening right now. Stay tuned for this edition of Eclipsium's Below the Surface. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface, the firmware and supply chain podcast. It's episode number 7 for March 29th, 2023. Mr. Scott Shag Shefferman is here with us. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks. This is always fun. Let's rock and roll.
Absolutely. Getting right into it, our guest today is Nicholas Starke. Nicholas Starke is a firmware security researcher focusing on network appliances and applications. Nick's work focuses on system firmware, specifically one of our favorites, UEFI, as well as higher-level Linux runtime firmware. Nick is located in Des Moines, Iowa, and when Nick is not hacking firmware, he can be found writing weird music or collaborating with other local security professionals. Nick, welcome to the show.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, man, it's good to have you here today. I wanted to start with, I guess first, how you got your start in information security.
Sure. So I came from a web development background. I started my career writing ASP.NET web applications for financial technology firms. And I was always really focused on the security components of the applications we developed. And from there, my interest in security, blossomed into new roles where I was actually working in a security context. I really early on, I was working on embedded firmware in my information security career once I moved out of development, and it really inspired me just working with the Linux runtime operating system to the point where I just wanted to learn more and more about the Linux kernel, and then I kept diving deeper and deeper until I eventually found myself researching UEFI systems to a large degree, and I have been very blessed in the capacity of my current role to be able to focus on that to a large degree and really kind of cut my teeth.
There aren't many researchers looking into UEFI. What got you, did you just discover it and go, wow, that's a rabbit hole I got to go down?
It was more the research of others that I was seeing that was really inspiring to me, just the really cool things that people were doing with developing persistence on really hardened systems, diving beneath the runtime operating system instance to achieve these persistence modes for very targeted attacks. Some of the first research I was exposed to for UEFI was by two of the Eclipsium researchers, Mickey and Jesse, and they after I saw the first presentation I saw by them, I actually reached out to them, and they were very welcoming of my questions, and that helped get me started a few years ago going down this road.
Yeah, that's awesome. We love Mickey and Jesse. Hopefully they'll make an appearance on this show at some point, I'm sure. I'm sure we can make that happen, right? What kind of things are going on today in UEFI, Nick, that really have you excited or maybe even concerned about the security of, as you've already pointed out, right, this very critical low-level functioning firmware?
Well, one of the big topics right now is the BlackLotus malware that was offered on the dark web, and I've looked into that as well as the vulnerability that underpins that entire package, the Baton Drop vulnerability, and that really drove home to me the concept of bring your own vulnerable bootloader and how that can be applied in many different contexts and scenarios beyond just Windows-based servers and desktops to even Linux-based systems. That I think we're going to see more and more attacks along those lines, maybe even using the same vulnerability, since it hasn't been, or it can't be mitigated across the board through DBX updates. So the BlackLotus situation has been very interesting recently, and that's something I've been following closely.
Yeah, I'm gonna turn over to Scott. Scott's like he's like so glad you brought that up, actually, right?
As it happens, right? Yeah. So, I had a friend in a trust group, and he's like, I'm seeing something really interesting because he knows like where I work and what I do. And he does threat intelligence all day long. He's like, this thing is for sale for $5,000. I'm like, what thing? So took a look, and that was on October 7th, which was about 7 hours after it was first posted. And I'm like, this is impossible. This is nation state level stuff. This is tradecraft level kind of development requirements, and there's no way somebody's selling this for only $5,000, which is effectively a zero cost barrier to entry. It's fully documented. That's weird. That's something usually nation states only do too, like we saw with the with shadow broker dump, etc. And so I'm looking through this. It's got an API, and it's it scales. And then at the last bullet on the for sale ad was, it does all things like, disable BitLocker and, Defender and all the other Microsoft level controls that would normally mitigate some of these kind of threats. And the last bullet was like, it runs on any platform, and it doesn't matter what platform it is. And that was what really, really caught my eye at first. You just, from a geek perspective, I'm like, no, this has to be fake. So obviously that got picked up by media and everything else. And the other gentleman from Kaspersky, I'm forgetting his name, we kind of co-discovered it at the same time. We were, I shouldn't even say, but we were trying to get access to that, and quite frankly, to analyze it, quite frankly. But then they went to, the other researcher went to press about it, caused a lot of interested folks were, leaning in, trying to ask good questions. We were flooded with questions at that point. But was it in the wild or not? And then, as we all three know, and most of the world knows now, it was discovered in the wild, and there are 16 plus samples on VirusTotal now that have been analyzed. And the whole thing is just mind blowing to me still. I mean, like, there's not a day that goes by I'm not waking up thinking about this changes everything. And without kind of diving in at first glance, you're like, well, there's a Microsoft patch for that, but people don't realize that for everyday problem with Baton Drop. And so any attacker can bring your own vulnerable driver, and you have a big problem. And then, Paul, combined with the news that you shared today in our chat with two of the one bootloader to rule them all bootloaders that Jesse and Mickey spoke about at DEF CON 30 for that talk, they were supposed to be revoked, and they weren't revoked correctly. And I'm just sitting here thinking, this combined with the BlackLotus kind of dynamic, all the things are in place: low cost, easy to use, practically script kiddie friendly.
Yeah, I think I like we get to develop new terms like pseudo-revocation. Like it was. But Nick, I want to go along those lines, though. I want to go back to something you said about revocation, and that is Microsoft could add to the DBX the revocation of those bootloaders. But it sounds like that doesn't fully fix the problem. Could you elaborate on that?
I'm not sure exactly on that one, Paul, to be honest. I think that one of the problems they would run into is the size of how many hashes they would have to fit into that DBX environment variable. I just don't think it'd be possible.
I think it's 32 kilobytes, and that is definitely one of the issues. I think the other issue is that there's like more than I don't fully understand the way Windows boots up and the way I understand the way Linux boots up, right? But so in Linux you've got shim, and then you typically have grub, and that loads the kernel. But like shim has to trust grub, so there's a trust there that isn't necessarily in the DBX, right? Because it's inside of shim, the way I understand it. I think Microsoft, what I was reading when this was all coming out, has a similar kind of thing, that there's an internal kind of validation. So the internal validation would also have to be updated in addition to like this, what is somewhat of an external revocation list in the DBX.
Yeah. So the way I understand this too, in that regard, is that we effectively have this for everyday problem because of Baton Drop, which is basically a logic or structural problem with secure boot going forward. And so now, if you tried to revoke all the vulnerable bootloaders out there, and there are many dozens of them, and more that are discovered on the daily, you have this issue where you would destroy backups and the ability to recover in the field for people that were using the same bootloaders. So the operational danger and even impact, the raw risk impact, if you will, is greater than the benefit or the will to choose to try to blacklist all of them. So that's why it's practically a forever day, because now secure boot is effectively broken via that vulnerability. It's not a good situation. And like Paul, I think a few episodes ago we had that whole episode just on trust. And if you just step back, you realize like this trust system we're talking about, like the boot process trust system, it's really not even. It's not a trust system. It's a ton of inferred and assumed and implied trust. And one of the folks on our team used to work at a company that was able to sign their own bootloaders, and they can do anything they want to, quite frankly. So once the provenance of an organization passes muster, if you will, your authorship of that code and what it does, like, for example, completely ignoring secure boot in some places, like I'm not going to honor that. That's like a primary function of a bootloader to do. That's one of its actually foremost jobs and roles, despite anything else it wants to do or needs to do. And you have bootloaders out there that don't even honor the secure boot process itself, because authorization is passed off. And once it's passed off, its job is just about, prepping the OS and on we go. So it's a fundamental problem. It blows my mind every day, because I initially looked at this process a few years ago, and I was kind of getting into this as a cryptographically semi-protected trust system, but it's not even a crypto system at all. At best, it's just saying that the binary is what it says it was, and we know it came from that organization. That's it. There's nothing to do with vetting malicious code. There's no QA involved. Like it's wild.
And attackers are taking advantage of. That's one thing they're taking advantage of, Scott. And Nick, I want to go back to you, because you said something earlier that attackers are kind of pressing into these deeper levels. Do you see drivers for that? Like, what's driving them down? Well, I mean, we talk about vulnerable drivers, right? But like, bring your own bootloader is even a level before that. What's driving them down to this level, in your opinion?
I think it's just trying to achieve persistence in a way that avoids security detection, security controls. I think that most attackers are realizing a user space agent alone is going to get picked up very quickly by, EDR systems, and it's not going to remain undetected for very long. From my understanding is the way the BlackLotus loaded its user space agent, it was able to disable all of the regular detections that would prevent that sort of software from running, and in that way, it achieves persistence and its goal of evading detection.
Yeah, it certainly gives an attacker persistence and stealth. Is two things we talk about a lot at Eclipsium, and my fear is that, on the one hand, it's good. I think it means EDR and operating system level and above detections are getting better, right? I mean, that's like wildly speculative, but let's just say, for argument's sake, they are getting better. That's good, but bad is that now they're dipping below this other level. And now, like, if there was a security poverty line that we talked about on modern computer systems today, they're dipping below the poverty line, because there's a lot of vulnerabilities in firmware, as you discover all the time, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the like when we did the research on the Conti leaks of those 60,000 messages in Russian language, and we did specific keyword searching to see if they were looking at this level, and they absolutely were. And not just with like the trick boot discovery, but the primary motive we discovered for them wasn't to brick a box. It wasn't only for persistence, but it was also for disabling, ironically, those same Microsoft and third-party AV EDR controls, because the actors here don't want to just necessarily persist. Some do, like nation states. They'd rather stay low for 5-6 years before they're discovered as a campaign. Other ones have shorter-term profit motives, like the Conti group. And so they want to still be able to go back up to the OS and find Active Directory and move laterally and drop payloads and ransomware, whatever they're going to do. And so they want to be able to disable those security controls, but make them look like they're still working. And they can do all of that from a UEFI bootkit.
Nick, tell us a little. Well, first, I want to say that listeners should check out your blog, because I follow it religiously. And recently, you had some posts about U-Boot. Was there something that drove you to look at U-Boot, or were you just curious?
Yeah, U-Boot recently introduced like an HTTP based network boot, and it was a very early implementation of HTTP boot, and it had some problems with it, some very easy to discover problems. And I looked at it very briefly, found some issues with it, and I ended up trying to figure out how to get this addressed and how to get it, you know, to the right people. And I realized that there's no like private correspondence with the U-Boot authors. And so like I saw where other researchers, specifically at NCC Group, had disclosure timelines of years trying to get a hold of U-Boot developers, and it ended up being public disclosure anyway, because there was no way of privately communicating with them. So I just wrote a blog post on what I found, and I hope that someday there's a way to contact them privately, so that there's a better way of getting these things fixed without just dumping it out on the internet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it was, I don't know if it was the Linux Foundation, or I think it might have been GitHub specifically, saying that for open source projects, they were going to create or give them functionality that allowed for private reporting of mostly security vulnerabilities, right? Because it was a bug, you just submit a pull request. But security related stuff should have a private mechanism. And I think we want, at least I hope that this is the case, we want open source developers to do what they do best and develop great software, not have to worry about all the overhead and other stuff that comes with running an open source project, such as, like, what's our communication mechanism for people that want to support bugs in this manner, right? Like, take that off their plate, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, I'm not critical at all of the U-Boot developers. I think they do a great job in general of developing very high quality software. And like I said, the HTTP boot functionality that I looked at was very early on. It hasn't even been released in a major release yet. It's probably subject to a lot more revisions than just the version I pulled off the master branch or the main branch at one point. So I don't say that to be critical of them at all.
And U-Boot's pretty common. I remember seeing that in like IoT stuff over the years. A lot of IoT stuff is using U-Boot.
That's where I see it mostly. I've seen it in a lot of different like small office, home office networking equipment vendors. They tend to use U-Boot a lot, and custom implementations of U-Boot at that.
And what was the vulnerability that you found? Is basically it can pull down any file from anywhere on boot?
It was the HTTP response status line. It's usually HTTP /1.1 OK 200 OK. And instead of OK, I'd put like 86 megabytes of A's, and that ended up overwriting the memory of the virtual device I was testing against, and causing it to access memory address 414.141.141.
I gotcha. Yeah, that's bad. Tell us about CVE Wednesday. I like this trend that you started on your blog.
CVE Wednesday was an attempt for me to really get serious about writing on my blog every week, and it was successful for about 5-6 weeks, and then I stopped doing it so often, so I need to get back to doing it. But CVE Wednesday was the idea was to take a recently published CVE and do like a root cause analysis on what happened and why it's vulnerable, and if there's any mitigations or how the fix works, things like that. Just take CVEs that were interesting to me and make me sit down and research and write on them to keep my technical skill set sharp. This is the whole idea.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you have a favorite one that you wrote up?
Yeah, I do like the U-boot one. There was also one on NASM that was very impractical from a security attacker perspective, offensive security perspective. But it was a lot of fun to go and like figure out why this assembler had this memory corruption problem when you fed it certain instruction inputs. So I really enjoyed it. It was a fun little deep dive into something I'm not normally looking at when, assemblers and compilers.
You also had one on Intel's AMT, and I still think that the overall security of Intel ME or CSME and AMT like really hasn't been evangelized enough. Nick, do you find that as well?
I mean, I've looked at it to a degree. I know that there have been security issues reported against it. Not many, but there have been in the past. And I think that just the web-based nature of AMT lends itself to all the common web application type attacks. And some of those are probably outside the threat model that Intel considers. And I think that's legitimate. The write-up I did on CVE Wednesday, or right before CVE Wednesday on Intel AMT, was required authentication and was really just like what an attack might look like. And I do think it's ripe for more research, right? Like I think that there's a jumping off point where I would encourage people to look at that as a target, because it has a really high impact if you find anything, right? It's if you find some sort of vulnerability, either server side or client side in this web application context, like it's going to have a high impact since AMT runs on very important computers.
Was this the one where you discovered that AMT could serve any file to any other AMT? Well, I thought that was like it was a moment for me. There was like a light bulb going off. Like, wait, why do they want this feature? Well, it's really about flexibility, not about security.
Yeah, so they used it for allowing developers to upload their own custom implementations of AMT. And I mean, there are open source implementations of the AMT web client that interface with the AMT server, which is not open source. But like it was, it's an attempt to add flexibility, let developers and enthusiasts have their own, library or component to interface with AMT instead of the Intel built one.
It's interesting. It's I think one of the things about the AMT and ME is it just comes pre-installed, and a lot of people don't even know it's there. And my advice is always to first recognize it's there, and then have a plan for how you're going to configure it. Like, don't just leave it there unconfigured, because there's different provisioning states. I think that's another thing that needs to be evangelized. If it's there, have a plan. Like if you're not going to use it, provision it to something. Do you have like a kind of same advice for people?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a write-up on this. They actually issued like a CVE for it, I think, about non-configured AMT instances where an attacker can get a hold of a laptop physically without AMT enabled, and then enable it, and then they can all do all the they can set the credentials to attacker controlled values, and then do whatever anyone could do physically at the computer through AMT. So I do hold that same view that people or administrators should set some sort of account on it and not just leave it at its default state.
The same thing for the BMC stuff, Scott, you and I talk about quite often now. Oh, I think you're on mute, Scott.
In the same context of AMT and BMCs, I think a lot of people don't also realize that has bus access to the UEFI, and you can do all sorts of stuff to the UEFI. And that's actually what the Conti group was doing, was fuzzing the PCI flash. They had an HECI sniffer developed. They had all sorts of crazy stuff to get secrets and be able to do things to UEFI as kind of their end game. BMCs are the same way, and attackers can do all the things that you can do pretty much in AMT, not quite, but you can do quite a lot of things, and you can move your attack, you can keep your attack at that low level and operate on those segments and jump hosts laterally via just BMC and IPMI, or you can move back up to the operating system and drop payloads, or you can hit another networking device. Or in an operational environment, you can send a packet of death and bring down an ICS component via the BMC, right? Or any kind of access, and it has its own network stack, and it's a Linux kernel running. It's scriptable. The permissions are all messed up. Everything pretty much runs as like root effectively. There's so many like core security problems at that level, and the assumption is, from a threat model perspective, is that bad guys don't have access to it. It should be segmented, not exposed to the internet like it often is, right? Like there's all sorts of problems with that assumption in terms of the threat model. It's a holy grail. Both of BMC and AMT are like holy grail positions to be at.
Yeah, Nick. So what's your advice for people that are trying to manage BMCs and AMTs, given that it's, as Scott said, and so true, like a ripe attack surface. Again, this is like a high privileged area of the system as well.
Yeah, I would say protect it in every way you can. I mean, there's been two suggestions right off the bat that are very applicable, and that's set a default account, set a strong administrator account, password and everything, and then also segment it off the network as well as you can. I would add on top of it network monitoring to make sure that who you want to access those resources is who is accessing those resources, and that kind of filters down into logging and PCAPs and all that stuff. So that would be my only addition to the other two. I'm sure there's more that could be done, but it kind of follows the standard network monitoring techniques.
How do we get people to update their UEFI firmware?
That's a great question. I mean, especially as dangerous as it can be, there's a lot of redundancy built into modern systems and everything, but it used to be if you were updating, I've had this happen, you were updating your BIOS or your UEFI and the power goes out, all of a sudden you have a dead host, right? And, you can, if you have the tools, you can reflash the SPI chip on it. But like a lot of, when I did this when I was 18 years old, I didn't have that kind of knowledge or tooling to revive my host, and I had to replace the motherboard.
Well, plus, but you need all the data to go back on the. I mean, hopefully you make a backup of it, or your OEM provides you a backup of it. But you need that, like the update that comes from the OEM that's like update your UEFI. That's not everything. You need to rebuild the spy flash chip, which has me concerned.
No, you would have to make an update before you'd have to
make
attach a chip clip.
Chip clip, yeah. Or dump it through some other. Could you dump it through some other mechanism?
Chipsec, I think can do that.
Chipsec can make a backup, and do that, or clip the chip, but you need a backup. But like most users, hey, like not only do you have to do, they're like, what's UEFI? What is that? What is a firmware update? And oh, by the way, you need a SPI controller and you need to clip the chip and back it up before you do that. Like this, it's hard for the end user.
Oh yeah, definitely. And even normal firmware updates. I mean, I hate to say this, but they scare people sometimes, right? Like there's a big screen that comes up that says, do not turn off your computer, in bright red text. It can be, to the end user, it can be intimidating. And I think that things that scare people make people not want to do it.
Yeah. Scott?
Well, I was going to ask Nick, like when you think about this from like a threat model perspective, one of the things we try to explore here too, just given the nature of the threat landscape now with, the conflict in Russia, Ukraine and the chip wars going on, there's a lot more destructive kind of motive of attacks coming out and impacting organizations. And you don't always read about those because they're not like a privacy event or a ransomware event that's really loud, etc. But from a threat model perspective, if an attacker bricks a UEFI, right, messes it up so that it's no longer functional, like you were saying, just like if the power goes out while you're updating it, it's the same difference. How do you normally frame that in your mind from like a threat model perspective in today's landscape?
I mean, it's certainly a very bad situation. I don't. I mean, let's say an attacker has some automated means by which they can brick 100,000 machines on a network. Like that's pretty much doomsday, right, for an organization if something like that happens. So, I think that it's not as likely as some of the other attacks we see, but it's something that defenders should be planning for, and risk professionals consider at least when they're developing contingency plans and things like that.
Yeah, like restoration, DRP. I was always thinking of like the Russian GRU behind NotPetya and how that was a ransomware, wormable ransomware, but with a destructive mode of destroying the MBRs. And everybody had to replace hard drives before they could even worry about restoring the data and the operating systems. But the same actor, APT28, or actually in this case, a Sandworm contingent, they have the same know-how. They have a LoJax already implanted. They research UEFI. They work with Conti Group via dotted lines, and the research that they were doing. I could see another NotPetya event that bricks the motherboard, if you will, to use your terms, versus just the hard drive, and the amount of impact that would have. I mean, NotPetya was bad enough on its own, billions of dollars of damage and operational impacts for years afterwards. But that's kind of what keeps me up at night when people ask me what keeps you up at night in this space. It's more like a worm that would target UEFI and just brick the motherboard.
And I certainly think an attack of that means is easier to do from a technical or conduct from a technical perspective than a highly sophisticated multi-staged malware payload that like goes up to the kernel and then goes up to user space. Like bricking a system's a lot easier than developing all the exploits and functionality you need to do all those other things.
It's funny. It's funny you say that, Nick. Was working with IoT devices years ago. I was like, well, I'm trying to do all this fancy stuff, backdoor the firmware, put new firmware on it, and I'm like. And I bricked quite a few in my day. And I was like, well, if my goal was just to destroy stuff, well, that would be way easier than what I'm trying to do. It's scary. And we've seen examples of that, right, out in the wild. And I think it's a very real threat, certainly. I hope that, and I guess that kind of segues into the next thing is that, my ShmooCon presentation, which I just gave to a private group this morning, as well, is all about like how to permanently brick your computer. And one of the aspects is, and things to think about, is how do we make sure that these computers are delivered more securely and protecting the spy flash specifically. Even if we hone in on that one thing, right? Like I'm required to have that slide in there when I talk about firmware on the PC, to have all the different components, and all those different components have firmware. But let's just talk about the spy flash. What can we do to encourage manufacturers to deliver that in a more secure manner that doesn't allow arbitrary writes and all of the different protection mechanisms we have?
Well, I mean, it's almost a people problem, a layer 8 problem. I think you have to trust who's delivering it, right? Like I don't know of any technical solution to that problem off the top of my head. There's a lot of different pushes towards like white glove services to build in trust to the delivery mechanism of how these machines are physically delivered to the customers. And I think from that perspective, it's just like I don't see anything that can provide like a cryptographic guarantee that I know of. I'm not saying there's not one. I'm just not well informed on the topic, I guess.
No, but I think your answer is spot on, though, Nick. It's not a technical thing. We know how to discover the misconfigurations of a spy flash, and to that extent, we know how to fix them too. We just need to put that process earlier in the supply chain, right? And give them the tools to be able to validate that before it completes that last leg of being shipped.
Yeah.
And it's
And I would
totally
say
a process
that-
thing.
Like not even just being shipped to, but like once the device is operational, how do you make sure that it stays the way that you took delivery of it? So even if you took delivery of a perfectly configured, secured core, BIOS write enables set to 0, all the things that you would want, right? How do you make sure that operationally it's not exposed to threats and updates that turn those features off, like with the trick boot vulnerability of basically a BIOS write enable vulnerability they were looking for? That's actually a pretty common. It's not the majority of systems that are shipped that way, but it's a big enough system where you have a campaign that can spew out 40,000 emotet infections and drop trick load payloads and download the PremiDL module back in October of 2020. That's a big enough blast radius in terms of campaign size where you can still find machines that have that bit set to 1 instead of 0, and that's a problem, right? Like that would allow attackers to do whatever they needed to do to the UEFI. There's some form of QA on the supply chain side before all devices ship, but also some kind of way to obviously that's what Eclipsium does, but we need this everywhere, right? It can't just be in like the financials and the government sector and DoD. It has to be like even in mid-sized businesses eventually, because they're just as exposed. So, yeah.
I'd like to add on to that and say that number's not going anywhere, right? Like those machines that have that misconfiguration, I mean, the number of them will decrease over time, but it's not going to drop to 0. We're always going to have older machines that have these vulnerabilities with them. So, I mean, I just want to reinforce the thought that we need ways of detecting those sort of misconfigurations after they've been deployed.
Yeah, for sure. It's a continuous process. Nick, what were some resources that you used to learn about UEFI? I think you and I talked about some of them. I think we have our favorites.
Yeah, sure. I've got a couple. So Bootkits and Rootkits, I may have those reversed. The book by Alex Matrosov and et al. And that was the first thing I read that really made me want to dive into more of how the boot process works. And it's a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. It's a dense read, but a good one. That's one of my favorite books on the topic. I took a class by, again, Mickey and Jesse called Firmware Implant.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's called. I forget the exact title, but Firmware Implant is in the title.
Yeah, it's that was a great class that exposed me to a lot of new ideas and a lot of the rudimentary concepts I guess I needed to master in order to progress in the field. There's a lot of different blog posts out there. I know that there's like a list of them that Zeno Kova keeps. A URL. I don't have the URL off the top of my head, but along those lines, his Arch 4001 class was foundational to my understanding of UEFI and BIOS. It's Arch 4001 is the BIOS class, and he Open Security Training 2 has additional classes on top of that at the 4000 level on UEFI, and I highly recommend all of those. Those are fascinating classes. They've done a great job. Open Security Training 2 has done a great job of developing those classes, and if I would recommend all 3 of those resources to anyone who is just starting out, and 2 of them are even free.
Yeah,
or no, one of them is free. Sorry.
It's the hard. I'm trying to find Mickey and Jesse's recent training. And we may have to update the show notes with that afterwards. But Zeno, Open Security, if you Google for Open Security Training, you'll land on his site. All of his training is free. And you mentioned all his classes are amazing. But he does have one specific on UEFI, Architecture 4021 Introductory UEFI. I think Nick and I both took that one. I was like, wow, I get some stuff now. This is great. But then Zeno also has a new one, Vulnerabilities 101, C, Family Software Implementation Vulnerabilities. I've started going through that one. Highly recommended. And also because, as you know, with Zeno, his training is it's hilarious. Like, it's so well done. Like, the way he explains things, it may be concepts that I was like somewhat familiar with, but then when Zeno explains, I'm like, oh, I get it now. And some of it's really funny.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really enjoy taking his classes, and they're very, very well put together. I agree entirely.
But I mean, I think it's a good call out to the community listening to come up to speed in these things, especially UEFI. It's super hard. Like the whole thing is super hard to understand. There's a lot to it. Like sometimes I ask Jesse questions and he's like, all right, that's like, we do like an entire day in our training, like in our full training. He's like, there's actually an entire day on what you just asked, Paul. He's like, so I'm going to try and summarize that, back to you in a couple of minutes. And so that's why it's important to have the reason I mentioned, to have these resources so we get more people who are researching this and looking into it and understanding it and, helping to solve these problems.
I'd like to add on to that it's just to encourage people who are interested in the subject to dive in. I've only been doing it for like 3 years, and I'm not a master of it by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm a lot further along than I was 3 years ago. And if I can do it, you can do it too.
I think yeah.
I was going to say,
right?
That's my line usually, because yeah, I mean, like I've been doing cybersecurity as long as we all have, 10 plus years or 20 plus years, right? And I'm always wondering, how did I go that long through that entire career doing all sorts of weird stuff and not understand this space at all? And it turns out I realized myself, I've been making the same assumptions that everybody's been making the last 20, 25 years during DFIRs, during understanding how operating systems work and machines work. In fact, the closest thing I was ever to understanding this space was back in the mid 90s when I was building gaming rigs in my basement, right? Like to play, Counter-Strike and other PC games when I'm putting together components. I actually had a better understanding then than I did the subsequent 25 years until the last 3 years. But what I want to say to the audience is, like, once you dive into this space and just a few light bulbs, like 3 or 4 light bulbs go off, and you get a level of comprehension of understanding something, then it's like super, super interesting. Then it's super fun. Then it's like you can't wait to understand more, because you realize you're dealing at like the foundation of computing itself. Like the whole entire trust model of everything we do above the hardware comes into question, like hyperscaler assumptions and containers and applications and zero trust I can't even look at it the same way now. Like it's all breaks the second you get these light bulbs going off.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, many of us were probably like, UEFI, like myself, was something you had to go into, like this new annoying thing that you had to go into and enable compatibility mode so that like whatever OS I put on there would boot, right? And it was a nuisance and annoying. I'm like, what is it? What, I can't boot a Linux jump drive. What's going on here? And then, you unpeel the layers and it's like, then you were disabling secure boot. Because like my Linux OS wouldn't, up to a certain time, a lot of Linux, even the installation instructions for most Linux distros were like, the first thing you have to do is go disable secure boot. And I'm like, well, that seems like super annoying and like security I don't need. And I definitely want to leave that disabled because it just gets in the way. And then once I unpacked it, I was like, oh, it's like really important. We need this. And especially we fast forward to today. We had the conversation about BlackLotus to bring it full circle. Like it's important because I think attackers are now pushing into thankfully we've had all this time to develop it and perfect it and get secure boot to the point where it is today. And it's not perfect by any stretch. Even I think it was Vincent Zimmer on last episode said we got some work to do with the mock utils and things like that. And I think most involved agree, like we got some work to do. BlackLotus shined a light on that, ironically enough. And I think moving forward, it's something we need to incorporate and understand how important it is.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious what you think on one of my primary assumptions that's been smashed, right, for 25 years or whatever, is that these threats are below the operating systems. But like you said, Paul, like if you're building a gaming rig, I'm going to turn off secure rig because who cares? I own this. It's in my house, and I'm not worried. But what we realize at some point in our careers and our education is that the bulk of these threats actually come from the operating system level and then go down to attack the UEFI or baseboard management controllers.
Yes.
And once I realized that, I'm like, oh my, we have a really big problem on our hands. I did not know that this was a bidirectional, super extensible.
Well, that's the big misconception that now that you say that, and I talk about like building computers as I still do today, right? And it was like, I thought the BIOS password is a physical thing, right? Which it is. But when Secure Boot came out, I think many people had that same assumption that, oh, I lumped that in with like my BIOS password. Like this is just for physical protection. If someone has physical access to my computer, and like you said, Scott, since I'm building a gaming rig and it lives in my office, I can disable those things and it should be fine. It's not. Even BIOS password, ironically enough, is still at play today to help prevent against some of these things as well. And we see mock-util, not that it's a BIOS password, right? But disabling secure boot, all those things it helps, right? It helps in certain scenarios. Just don't forget your BIOS password.
I mean, I think it was Yuri, like 11 years ago or so, was the first person on a stage at a conference to show how to bypass secure boot. Yes. It was research, and it didn't. I mean, here we are. It took a decade later before we see something in the wild like BlackLotus. But I mean, for all of its woes, I guess secure boot did pretty well for a decade. But now it's broken.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's horribly broken. I think also a lot of the techniques are still and basically a lot of the techniques boil down to really put it at a high level. Like you're mucking with NVRAM variables that you shouldn't be able to muck with, and therefore you can trick the system into bypassing secure boot in some way.
Yeah,
it still comes down to that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Nick, you run a local security user group. Tell us about that.
I don't run it, but I'm a participant in it. It's SecDSM. It's a security Des Moines. We get together once a month, have some presentations, drink some beer, eat some pizza. I highly encourage anyone in the Midwest or Iowa to join us. It's the first Thursday of every month, and you can find out more information at secdsm.org.
Outstanding. Nick, thanks so much for appearing on Below the Surface.
Thank you for having me.
Scott, thank you, my friend, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.